Picture this. You're dating an incredible woman. She's intelligent, beautiful, successful. Everything seems perfect. You're treating her with respect, showing genuine interest in her life, being emotionally available when she needs support. You're doing everything right, according to conventional wisdom about relationships. But then something strange starts happening. She becomes distant. She starts picking fights over trivial things. She cancels dates at the last minute. She tells you she needs space. And eventually, she ends the relationship, often with those devastating words, "You're too good for me," or "I'm not ready for someone like you." You're left confused and heartbroken, wondering what you did wrong. How can being a good man be the problem? How can treating someone well drive them away? What you've just experienced is one of the most counterintuitive and painful patterns in modern dating. Women consistently push away the very men who would treat them best, while gravitating toward those who treat them poorly. This isn't about women being irrational or self-destructive. There are deep psychological mechanisms at work here, rooted in evolutionary biology and reinforced by modern social conditioning. Understanding these patterns won't just help you navigate relationships more successfully. It will fundamentally change how you view attraction, commitment, and human behavior itself. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you think you know about what women want in relationships. The uncomfortable truth is that women are biologically programmed to interpret kindness as weakness and availability as desperation. This programming runs so deep that even when women consciously want to choose good men, their subconscious attraction mechanisms actively work against that choice. The first pattern you need to understand is what I call the security paradox. Women claim they want security and stability in relationships, yet these very qualities often kill their attraction. When a man provides too much emotional security too quickly, he eliminates the psychological tension that creates and maintains romantic interest. Think about it from an evolutionary perspective. For millions of years, women had to be extremely selective about their mating choices because pregnancy made them vulnerable for 9 months, and child-rearing required massive resources. A woman who chose a weak or unreliable mate could literally die along with her offspring. This created intense selection pressure for women to be attracted only to men who demonstrated strength, resources, and the ability to protect them. But here's where it gets complicated. The traits that signal strength and reliability in a mate aren't always the same traits that create romantic excitement and sexual attraction. A man who is always available, always agreeable, and always accommodating might be a reliable partner, but his behavior signals to her subconscious that he has no other options. If he had other choices, why would he be so eager to please her? This is why women often describe feeling bored or suffocated in relationships with genuinely good men. It's not that they don't appreciate kindness and stability, it's that their attraction mechanisms are calibrated to respond to uncertainty and challenge. When a man removes all uncertainty from the equation by being completely predictable and available, he inadvertently removes the psychological ingredients that create lasting attraction. The second pattern is the investment imbalance trap. Good men typically front-load their emotional investment in relationships. They show their interest clearly, make themselves available whenever needed, and prioritize the woman's happiness above their own needs. This seems like the right approach, but it creates a fundamental power imbalance that ultimately destroys attraction. When you consistently invest more energy, time, and emotion into a relationship than you receive back, you signal lower value to the woman's subconscious. Her biological programming interprets your eagerness as evidence that she's the best you can do, which means she can probably do better. This isn't conscious manipulation on her part. It's an automatic response that occurs below the level of awareness. Women are constantly calibrating the investment levels in their relationships. They notice who texts first more often, who initiates plans more frequently, who compromises more readily, and who shows more emotional vulnerability. The person who consistently invests more loses attraction from the other person, not because they don't deserve love, but but because humans are wired to value what requires effort to obtain. This creates a cruel irony for good men. Their generous nature and willingness to prioritize their partner's needs actually works against them in creating lasting attraction. The man who drops everything when she calls gets taken for granted, while the man who sometimes has other priorities maintains her interest and respect. The third pattern involves what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. This is one of the most powerful psychological principles affecting human behavior, yet most people have never heard of it. When rewards come unpredictably, they create much stronger psychological attachment than when they come consistently. Good men typically provide consistent, predictable emotional rewards to their partners. They compliment regularly, show affection frequently, and maintain steady emotional availability. This consistency, while admirable from a moral standpoint, fails to create the psychological hook that keeps someone emotionally invested. Meanwhile, men who are inconsistent in their attention and affection often create much stronger emotional bonds. When a woman receives intermittent validation from a man, her brain becomes psychologically hooked on getting more. She starts thinking about him constantly, analyzing his behavior, and working harder to earn his approval. This mental preoccupation gets mistaken for deep attraction and love. The woman dating a consistently kind and available man doesn't have to work for his attention, so she doesn't invest mental energy thinking about him. The woman dating an unpredictable man becomes psychologically obsessed because she never knows when the next reward is coming. Her brain interprets this uncertainty as evidence that he must be high value. Otherwise, why would his attention be so scarce? This principle explains why women often stay in relationships with men who treat them poorly while leaving relationships with men who treat them well. It's not that they enjoy being mistreated. It's that inconsistent treatment creates stronger psychological bonds than consistent kindness. The fourth pattern centers on the challenge and conquest dynamic. Women are biologically programmed to be attracted to men they have to work to win over. This programming exists because throughout evolutionary history, men who were easily won were likely to be easily lost. A man who had many options wouldn't commit quickly or easily, so a woman had to prove her value to secure his commitment. Good men often remove all challenge from the courtship process. They make their interest obvious from the beginning, agree with everything she says, and avoid any behavior that might create conflict or tension. While this approach feels respectful and considerate, it eliminates the psychological satisfaction women get from winning over a desirable man. When there's no challenge involved in gaining someone's affection, that affection feels less valuable. It's basic human psychology. We treasure what we have to work for and dismiss what comes easily. The good man who immediately shows his hand and makes himself completely available has just made himself psychologically worthless in terms of conquest value. This doesn't mean men should be cruel or manipulative. It means they should maintain their own standards, boundaries, and independent lives even while dating. The man who has his own goals, his own social circle, and his own interests that he won't abandon for a relationship presents a challenge that activates women's attraction mechanisms. The fifth pattern involves the provider versus lover distinction. Women experience two different types of attraction toward men, often simultaneously. Provider attraction is based on a man's ability to offer resources, stability, and long-term security. Lover attraction is based on his ability to generate excitement, passion, and sexual desire. Good men typically excel at provider attraction. They demonstrate reliability, financial stability, emotional maturity, and commitment potential. These qualities make them excellent husband material from a logical standpoint. However, they often fail to generate lover attraction, which is based on more primal factors like confidence, unpredictability, and sexual dominance. The tragedy is that many women choose lovers in their youth and then seek providers when they're ready to settle down. They spend their most attractive years with men who excite them sexually but offer little long-term potential. then try to transition to relationships with good men who can provide stability but generate little passion. This creates a fundamental mismatch where the good man gets a woman who has already given her peak attraction and sexual energy to other men. He receives her commitment when her options are limited, rather than when she's genuinely excited about him. Many women in these relationships struggle with the lack of passion and excitement, leading to the very behavior we started with, pushing away the good man because the relationship lacks the intensity they experienced in their youth. Understanding these patterns reveals why the conventional advice given to men about relationships is often counterproductive. Being nice, accommodating, and consistently available doesn't create attraction. It signals lower value and eliminates the psychological ingredients necessary for lasting romantic interest. The women who push good men away aren't being irrational or self-destructive. They're responding to biological programming that served their ancestors well for millions of years. This programming prioritizes genetic fitness and survival value over conscious preferences for kindness and stability. The men who understand these dynamics can learn to be good while still maintaining the psychological elements that create attraction. They can be kind without being weak, generous without being taken for granted, and committed without being desperate. The key is understanding that attraction and compatibility operate on different principles, and both are necessary for successful long-term relationships. This knowledge isn't about becoming manipulative or treating women poorly. It's about understanding the deeper psychological forces that drive human behavior so you can navigate relationships more effectively. The man who grasps these patterns can choose to work with women's attraction mechanisms rather than against them, creating relationships that satisfy both her conscious desires for a good partner and her unconscious need for excitement and challenge. The good news is that these patterns are predictable and manageable once you understand them. The bad news is that most men will never learn these truths and will continue to be confused and hurt when their kindness and dedication drive women away instead of drawing them closer. The sixth pattern is the emotional validation trap. Good men typically become emotional support systems for the women they're dating, always available to listen, always ready to provide comfort, always willing to solve her problems. This seems like the foundation of a healthy relationship, but it creates a dynamic that slowly erodes romantic attraction. When a man becomes her primary source of emotional validation and support, he transforms from a romantic interest into a therapeutic resource. She begins to see him as someone who exists to make her feel better, rather than someone who challenges her to grow and improve. This shift happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day she realizes she no longer sees him as a sexual being, but as a friend who happens to be male. The biological programming that drives this response is ancient and powerful. Throughout human evolution, women needed to distinguish between men who could provide emotional comfort and men who could provide genetic advantages. The males who were always available to soothe and support often weren't the same males who had the strength and resources to ensure offspring survival. Modern women inherit this psychological wiring. When a man is too emotionally available, too eager to absorb her problems, too willing to prioritize her emotional state over his own needs, her subconscious categorizes him as a caretaker rather than a mate. She may care deeply about him, but she stops feeling sexually attracted to him because her biological programming doesn't associate caretaking behavior with genetic fitness. This explains why women often describe losing attraction to partners who are too understanding or too supportive. It's not that they don't value emotional support, it's that unlimited emotional availability signals weakness to their evolutionary programming. A strong, high-value male wouldn't have unlimited time to manage her emotional needs because he would have his own important pursuits and challenges demanding his attention. The seventh pattern involves what I call the mystery elimination effect. Good men typically share everything about themselves early in relationships. They're transparent about their feelings, open about their past, honest about their insecurities. and eager to create intimacy through vulnerability. This emotional transparency, while admirable, often kills the intrigue that sustains long-term interest. Mystery isn't about deception or withholding important information. It's about maintaining depth and complexity that keeps someone interested in discovering more about you. When you reveal everything about yourself immediately, you eliminate the gradual discovery process that builds emotional investment over time. Women are naturally curious creatures who enjoy the process of uncovering layers of a man's personality, history, and character. When a good man eliminates all mystery by sharing everything up front, he removes the psychological satisfaction women get from gradually earning access to deeper parts of his inner world. She stops working to understand him because there's nothing left to discover. This pattern is particularly destructive in the digital age, where men often share their entire emotional landscape through text messages, social media posts, and constant communication. The woman who receives detailed updates about every aspect of his daily life, every emotional fluctuation, every thought and feeling, quickly becomes bored because he's psychologically predictable. The eighth pattern centers on the leadership vacuum. Good men often defer to women's preferences in an attempt to be considerate and egalitarian. They ask what she wants to do for dates, where she wants to eat, what movie she wants to watch, how she wants to handle various situations. This approach seems respectful, but it creates a leadership vacuum that many women find deeply unattractive. Despite decades of social conditioning about equality, women still respond positively to masculine leadership in romantic contexts. This doesn't mean dominance or control. It means the ability to make decisions confidently, take charge of situations, and provide direction when needed. When a man constantly defers to her choices, he signals that he either lacks confidence in his own judgment or doesn't care enough to have preferences. Women interpret this deference as weakness rather than respect. From an evolutionary perspective, a male who couldn't or wouldn't make decisions was a liability during times of crisis or danger. Modern women inherit this programming even though they may consciously believe they want equal decision-making in relationships. The man who always asks what she wants to do is inadvertently communicating that he has no vision, no preferences, and no leadership capacity. Even women who consider themselves strong and independent often find this lack of masculine direction unattractive. They want a partner who can take charge when necessary, not someone who treats every decision as a negotiation. The ninth pattern involves the scarcity versus abundance mindset. Good men often operate from scarcity when they find a woman they like. They become afraid of losing her, so they modify their behavior to avoid any potential conflict or disappointment. They cancel plans with friends to spend more time with her, give up hobbies she doesn't share, and gradually eliminate other women from their social circle to prove their commitment. This scarcity behavior sends powerful signals to a woman's subconscious. When a man acts like she's his only option, like losing her would be devastating, like he has nothing else going on in his life worth protecting, she begins to wonder why. If he were truly valuable, wouldn't he have other opportunities? If he were genuinely attractive, wouldn't other women be competing for his attention? Meanwhile, men who maintain abundance mentality, who act like they have options even when they don't, who keep their own lives interesting and full regardless of relationship status, signal higher value to women's evolutionary programming. They're not trying to manipulate or deceive. They're simply maintaining the psychological posture that attractive, successful men naturally possess. This abundance isn't about actually having multiple women interested. It's about maintaining the inner confidence and life satisfaction that makes someone naturally attractive. The man who needs a relationship to feel complete will always be less attractive than the man who views relationships as a nice addition to an already fulfilling life. The 10th pattern is the comfort zone acceleration trap. Good men often try to accelerate intimacy and commitment because they've found someone they genuinely care about. They want to move in together quickly, talk about the future early, and establish exclusive commitment as soon as possible. This eagerness, while understandable, often pushes women away because it eliminates the gradual process of earning deeper connection. Women are generally more cautious about commitment because they have more at stake in romantic relationships. They need time to evaluate a man's character, consistency, and long-term potential before fully investing emotionally. When a good man tries to rush this process, he triggers psychological resistance rather than appreciation. The biological basis for this response is straightforward. Throughout evolutionary history, women who made mating decisions too quickly often suffered serious consequences. They needed time to assess whether a male would stick around after mating, whether he had the resources to support offspring, and whether he possessed the genetic qualities worth reproducing. Modern women inherit this cautious programming even in casual dating contexts. When a man pushes for too much intimacy too quickly, her instincts tell her to slow down and reevaluate. The good man who's eager to commit often gets rejected not because she doesn't like him, but because he's moving faster than her biological programming feels safe with. These patterns reveal why good men consistently struggle in modern dating, despite possessing the qualities that should theoretically make them ideal partners. They're fighting against millions of years of evolutionary programming with conscious logic and moral reasoning. Unfortunately, attraction doesn't operate on logical principles. It operates on biological imperatives that often contradict what people say they want in relationships. The men who succeed romantically aren't necessarily better people than the good men who struggle. They're simply men who understand how to work with women's attraction mechanisms rather than against them. They know how to be valuable without being desperate, kind without being weak, interested without being needy, and committed without being boring. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean abandoning your values or becoming someone you're not. It means learning to express your good qualities in ways that align with how attraction actually works, rather than how you think it should work. The goal isn't to manipulate women or trick them into relationships. The goal is to become the kind of man who naturally generates both respect and desire. Someone who can be genuinely good while still being genuinely attractive. The 11th pattern is what I call the emotional labor imbalance. Good men frequently become the sole managers of relationship harmony. They're the ones who initiate difficult conversations, who work to resolve conflicts, who check in on the relationship's health, and who invest the most energy in making sure everything runs smoothly. This seems like mature, responsible behavior, but it creates a dynamic where the woman becomes emotionally passive while the man does all the psychological heavy lifting. When you're constantly working harder than she is to maintain the relationship, you're essentially training her brain to devalue what you're providing. Humans naturally appreciate what requires effort from them and take for granted what comes without effort. The woman who doesn't have to invest in relationship maintenance stops feeling psychologically connected to its success or failure. This pattern is particularly insidious because it disguises itself as emotional maturity. The good man tells himself he's being the bigger person by always addressing problems, always seeking resolution, always working to improve communication. But what he's actually doing is removing her need to invest emotional labor in the relationship's survival. Women who don't have to fight for their relationships often don't feel deeply attached to them. The psychological investment principle works both ways. Just as you value what you work hard to obtain, you also become more attached to what you work hard to maintain. When a man handles all the emotional maintenance, the woman never develops the deep psychological investment that creates lasting commitment. The 12th pattern involves the competition elimination mistake. Good men often remove themselves from competitive dynamics with other men because they believe loyalty and commitment should be enough to maintain a woman's interest. They stop engaging with other women socially. They avoid situations where they might appear attractive to others, and they essentially take themselves off the sexual marketplace to prove their dedication. This behavior backfires because it eliminates social proof and pre-selection, two of the most powerful attraction triggers in human psychology. When other women find a man attractive, it signals to his partner that she's with someone desirable. When other women stop paying attention to him because he's made himself unavailable, it signals that he's been removed from sexual circulation. Women's attraction mechanisms are constantly calibrating their partner's market value based on how others respond to him. If other women ignore him, if he seems to have no other options, if he appears to be completely off the dating market, her subconscious interprets this as evidence that his value has declined. She begins to wonder if she could do better because nobody else seems to want what she has. The biological programming behind this response is ancient and powerful. Throughout human evolution, women who mated with males that other females ignored often ended up with genetically inferior offspring. Males who attracted attention from multiple females were more likely to possess valuable genetic traits worth reproducing. Modern women inherit this competitive assessment mechanism even in committed relationships. They don't want their partners to cheat, but they do want to feel like they're with someone other women would want. The good man who completely removes himself from all competitive dynamics inadvertently signals that he's no longer competition worthy. The 13th pattern is the emotional intensity reduction trap. Good men typically create stable, predictable emotional environments in their relationships. They avoid conflict, minimize drama, and work to maintain consistent positive interactions. This emotional stability, while healthy from a psychological wellness perspective, often fails to create the intensity that women associate with passionate love. Women's romantic programming is calibrated to interpret emotional intensity as evidence of deep connection. Throughout evolutionary history, the relationships that mattered most were the ones that generated strong emotional responses. Love, fear, anger, jealousy, excitement, and passion all indicated that important survival and reproductive issues were at stake. When a relationship becomes too emotionally stable, too predictable, too free of intensity, women's subconscious begins to categorize it as less important. The absence of emotional peaks and valleys gets interpreted as evidence that the relationship lacks significance. She may feel comfortable and secure, but comfort and security don't trigger the same neurochemical responses as excitement and uncertainty. This explains why women often describe feeling bored or unfulfilled in relationships with genuinely good men, even when they can't identify anything specifically wrong. Their emotional programming is designed to respond to intensity, and without it, they feel like something essential is missing. The good man, who creates perfect emotional stability, has inadvertently created perfect emotional boredom. The woman who never feels jealous, never feels uncertain, never experiences emotional highs and lows, never feels like the relationship is at risk, gradually loses the passionate feelings that originally drew her to him. The 14th pattern involves what I call the masculine energy depletion cycle. Good men often suppress their natural masculine traits because they've been taught that traditional masculinity is problematic or outdated. They become more agreeable, more emotionally expressive, more collaborative, and more focused on creating harmony than on pursuing their own goals and ambitions. This suppression of masculine energy creates a polarity problem in heterosexual relationships. Women are naturally drawn to masculine energy because it complements their feminine energy. When a man becomes too similar to a woman in his emotional expression, communication style, and behavioral patterns, he eliminates the energetic differences that create sexual attraction. Masculine energy isn't about dominance or aggression. It's about direction, purpose, strength, and the ability to remain centered under pressure. When good men abandon these qualities in favor of being more emotionally available and accommodating, they often lose the very traits that made them attractive in the first place. Women need to feel feminine energy in contrast to masculine energy. When both partners operate from similar energetic frequencies, the sexual tension that drives romantic attraction begins to dissipate. The woman may love and appreciate her partner, but she stops feeling the polarity that creates desire and passion. The 15th pattern is the gratitude deficit cycle. Good men often give far more than they receive in relationships, but they rarely express their needs or expectations clearly. They operate from a service mentality, believing that their value comes from what they provide rather than from who they are. This creates relationships where their contributions become invisible and taken for granted. When someone consistently receives without having to give back, proportionally, they begin to see that generosity as normal rather than special. The good man who always pays for dates, always drives, always plans activities, always provides emotional support, gradually trains the woman to expect these behaviors without appreciating them. The psychological principle at work here is hedonic adaptation. Humans quickly adjust to positive changes in their environment and begin treating extraordinary treatment as ordinary. The woman who initially felt grateful for a man's generosity stops noticing it after it becomes routine. What once felt special becomes expected. This pattern is particularly destructive because it creates resentment on both sides. The good man begins to feel unappreciated and taken for granted, while the woman begins to feel like his giving comes with unspoken expectations that make her uncomfortable. Neither person is consciously creating this dynamic, but it emerges naturally when giving becomes one-sided. The 16th pattern involves the authenticity paradox. Good men often present idealized versions of themselves in relationships, hiding their flaws, suppressing their negative emotions, and pretending to be more perfect than they actually are. This seems like it should make them more attractive, but it often has the opposite effect, because it eliminates the humanity that creates genuine connection. Women are naturally skilled at detecting incongruence between someone's presented self and their authentic self. When a man is trying too hard to appear perfect, when he's hiding parts of his personality, when he's suppressing natural human emotions like frustration or disappointment, women sense the performance and begin to distrust what they're seeing. Authentic connection requires vulnerability, imperfection, and the full spectrum of human emotion. The good man who never gets angry, never shows weakness, never admits mistakes, never displays negative emotions, creates an artificial persona that women find impossible to connect with deeply. The biological basis for this response is protective. Throughout evolutionary history, males who hid their true nature often did so because they had something dangerous or deceptive to conceal. Women who could detect deception and incongruence were more likely to avoid potentially harmful partnerships. Modern women inherit this sensitivity to authenticity, even in contemporary dating contexts. They're more attracted to men who are genuinely flawed but honest about it than to men who pretend to be perfect. The good man who shows his complete humanity, including his struggles and imperfections, often creates deeper attraction than the good man who maintains a flawless facade. These patterns reveal the complex psychological landscape that good men must navigate in modern relationships. They're not failing because they lack value or because women prefer to be treated poorly. They're struggling because they don't understand how their well-intentioned behaviors interact with ancient biological programming that operates below conscious awareness. The solution isn't to become a different person or to abandon your values. The solution is to learn how to express your authentic goodness in ways that align with how attraction actually functions. You can be kind without being weak, generous without being taken for granted, committed without being desperate, and caring without being suffocating. Understanding these patterns gives you the power to create relationships where your good qualities are appreciated rather than taken for granted, where your kindness is seen as strength rather than weakness, and where your commitment is valued rather than assumed. The women who push good men away aren't broken or irrational. They're responding to psychological forces that have shaped human mating behavior for millions of years. The men who learn to work with these forces rather than against them discover that being good and being attractive aren't mutually exclusive. They can maintain their integrity while creating the kind of relationships they actually want, where their value is recognized, their efforts are appreciated, and their love is reciprocated with the same intensity they give. This knowledge won't solve every relationship challenge, but it will help you understand why certain behaviors consistently produce certain results. Armed with this understanding, you can make conscious choices about how to present yourself, how to structure your relationships, and how to maintain attraction while staying true to your values. The good man who understands female psychology has a tremendous advantage over both the good man who doesn't and the bad man who treats women poorly. He can provide everything women consciously want while also satisfying the unconscious needs that drive their attraction and commitment. This is the path to relationships that are both meaningful and passionate, both stable and exciting, both loving and lasting. The 17th pattern is the approval addiction cycle. Good men often become psychological slaves to their partner's emotional state, constantly monitoring her mood and adjusting their behavior to maintain her happiness. They walk on eggshells, avoid topics that might upset her, and sacrifice their own needs to prevent any negative emotional reactions. This seems considerate and loving, but it creates a power dynamic that slowly destroys both respect and attraction. When you make someone else's emotional state your primary responsibility, you hand over control of your own well-being to their unpredictable feelings and reactions. You become reactive rather than proactive, responding to her emotional weather instead of maintaining your own emotional center. This reactive behavior signals to her subconscious that you're not emotionally strong enough to handle conflict or maintain your ground under pressure. Women need to feel that their partner can remain stable and centered, even when they're not at their best. Throughout evolutionary history, males who became emotionally destabilized by female emotional fluctuations were less likely to provide consistent protection and resources during critical periods. Modern women inherit this need for emotional stability from their partners, even though they may not consciously recognize it. The good man who constantly seeks approval and validation from his partner inadvertently trains her to see him as emotionally dependent rather than emotionally strong. She begins to lose respect for someone who seems to need her approval more than she needs his. This shift in the power dynamic rarely reverses once it's established, because respect is much harder to rebuild than it is to lose. The 18th pattern involves what I call the sexual energy suppression trap. Good men often desexualize their interactions with women they care about because they want to be seen as respectful and non-threatening. They avoid sexual tension, minimize physical escalation, and treat romantic interests more like friends than potential lovers. This approach seems morally superior, but it eliminates the sexual polarity that creates romantic attraction. Sexual energy isn't about being crude or inappropriate. It's about maintaining the masculine presence that creates attraction and desire. When a man suppresses his sexual nature completely, he removes himself from the romantic category in a woman's mind. She may appreciate his respect and friendship, but she won't feel the chemical attraction that leads to romantic love. Women want to feel desired by men they're attracted to. When a good man fails to express healthy sexual interest, when he treats her like a sister rather than a potential lover, when he's so careful to be respectful that he eliminates all sexual tension, she begins to question whether he's truly attracted to her or whether he's just being nice. This pattern is particularly destructive in the early stages of dating, where sexual tension and romantic escalation are necessary to move from friendship into romance. The good man who's afraid to show sexual interest often gets categorized as a friend, while men who express healthy sexual confidence move into the lover category. The biological programming behind this response is straightforward. Women need to feel sexually desired to feel feminine and attractive. A man who shows no sexual interest, who seems content with purely platonic interaction, signals that he either doesn't find her sexually appealing or lacks the masculine energy necessary for romantic partnership. The 19th pattern is the boundary dissolution mistake. Good men often have weak or non-existent boundaries because they want to be accommodating and avoid conflict. They say yes when they mean no. They accept behavior they don't actually approve of, and they allow their time and energy to be consumed without reciprocation. This boundary weakness, while appearing generous, actually creates resentment and reduces attraction. Boundaries aren't about being difficult or unreasonable. They're about having standards for how you expect to be treated. and the courage to enforce those standards, even when it creates temporary discomfort. When a man has no boundaries, he signals that he doesn't value himself highly enough to demand respect from others. Women test boundaries constantly, not because they're manipulative, but because they need to understand where a man's limits are. A man without boundaries fails these tests repeatedly, which gradually erodes her respect and attraction. She begins to see him as someone who can be walked over rather than someone who commands respect. The psychological principle at work here is that people treat you the way you teach them to treat you. When you consistently accept poor treatment, late cancellations, disrespectful behavior, or one-sided arrangements, you're teaching the other person that this level of treatment is acceptable. Over time, this becomes the new normal in the relationship. Strong boundaries actually make relationships better, not worse. They create clarity about expectations. They prevent resentment from building up. And they demonstrate self-respect that others find attractive. The good man who learns to set and enforce healthy boundaries discovers that women respect him more, not less, when he values himself enough to have standards. The 20th pattern involves the masculine purpose abandonment cycle. Good men often abandon their personal missions, goals, and ambitions when they enter relationships because they want to prioritize their partner and prove their commitment. They stop pursuing challenging career goals. They give up time-consuming hobbies. They reduce their social activities, and they make the relationship the center of their existence. This seems like dedication and love, but it eliminates one of the most attractive qualities a man can possess: having a compelling purpose that extends beyond the relationship. Women are attracted to men who are going somewhere in life, who have missions that matter to them, who are building something meaningful with their time and energy. When a man makes a woman his primary purpose in life, he removes the very quality that made him attractive in the first place. She fell for someone who was passionate about his goals and ambitions, someone who had interesting things going on in his life, someone who was building towards something significant. When he abandons all of that to focus solely on her, he becomes less interesting and less attractive. The choice is yours. You can continue operating from the nice guy playbook, wondering why your kindness keeps getting punished with rejection and heartbreak. Or you can accept these uncomfortable truths about female psychology and start building the kind of relationships where your value is recognized, your efforts are appreciated, and your love is returned with the same intensity you give. The good man who understands these patterns isn't abandoning his values. He's learning to express them in ways that actually work.